Yeah, there's just a machine grinding away, doing various kinds of things. Was that an answer? Okay, all right. Sometimes I don't give answers, right, even though I intend to. So you have to stop me and say, do something else. Yes? Yeah, unfortunately, there are two different kinds of functionalism. There's the good functionalism and there's the bad functionalism. And philosophers and some cognitive scientists have embraced what I'd like to think of as the bad functionalism. Okay, and the bad functionalism just is an idea, is just the idea that what the mind does is perform certain kinds of operations on inputs to generate certain kinds of outputs. So you can think about any kind of information processing machine, whether it's a computer or a brain, in those kinds of terms. And so what you can do, for example, is simply say, well, we're going to identify consciousness with these kinds of functions. Okay, that's one version of the bad functionalism. And as Searle has pointed out, that's not right. That can't be right. And the reason it can't be right is you can give a third-person description to functions of a machine, but that leaves out what's essentially important about consciousness, which is that it's a first-person experience. Okay, that's basically Searle's philosophical argument against that kind of functionalism. This is one of those times when people in psychology and cognitive science use the same word to mean two different things. Okay, so you've got this philosophical functionalism, which is what I just described, and then beginning in the 19th century in psychology, you had what was known as Chicago functionalism, because it had its origins really at the University of Chicago with people like John Dewey and James W. Angel and other people whose names you don't have to know, okay? But this is an example in which you're going to get more than you wanted. And they were all these guys were influenced by, and sometimes students of, William James. But the idea there was that Chicago functionalism had the idea that mind had a function, okay, and that the function of mind was to aid the organism's adaptation to the environment, okay. Now that's a very different kind of functionalism than the philosophical functionalism that we talk about in a course like this. So it's important to kind of keep that straight, especially if you're looking at, say, the history of psychology or the history of ideas in psychology. Anything else here? All right. Then we get to more Ravenswoe. He talks about psychophysics as I did. He talks about structuralism as I did. I didn't talk about Gestalt psychology, but there's a school in Gestalt psychology that, again, tried to get away from the stimulus and talk about how brains and minds organize experience in various ways. Ravenswoe repeats what I talked about from William James, and he talks about John B. Watson's objections to defining psychology as a science of mental life or a science of consciousness. And again, what were those objections? From Watson's point of view, you can't have an objective science of something subjective. You can't have a public science of something that's private. So what you've got to do is base your science on something that's publicly and objectively observable, and that's behavior and the stimuli that give rise to it, and that's what behaviorism was all about. And it took us 50 years to get over that, and now we've got the cognitive psychology and cognitive science that's quite willing to go inside what B.F. Skinner called the black box of the human organism and try to figure out how the mind actually works. And it's the rise of cognitive psychology and cognitive science that allowed psychologists to start thinking about problems of consciousness, again, however shyly they approach these things. Questions there? Good. Okay. Then we get to more introspection. There actually are relationships between the text and the lectures. Ravenswood talks about qualia and the search for qualia and what people think of as qualia. And then he makes the important point, echoing James, that it's one thing to say, oh, I have the experience of red, or I have the experience of a rancid a taste, or whatever your basic quality of taste are, but that consciousness isn't just about experiential states. Consciousness is about what those experiential states themselves are about, that mental states are always representational. They represent something other than themselves. So I'm not just conscious of a funny kind of red. What I'm conscious of is a chair over there in the corner that is kind of sort of red or purple or whatever. Being male, I only have 7 color names. And then Ravenswood talks about the relationship between attention and consciousness, kind of foreshadowing the lectures that are coming later, and talks about a couple of interesting phenomena that seem to suggest that the link between attention and consciousness might be fairly strong, but might not be as strong as you would think. Inattentional blindness occurs when a subject doesn't see something that's outside the focus of his or her attention. That's what inattentional blindness is. And it's suggested to Mack and Rock that there's no consciousness without attention. Okay? If you're not paying attention to something, you can't be conscious of it. But there are other phenomena that Ravenswood talks about a little bit, which suggests that you can be unconscious of something despite the fact that you're paying attention to it. And a classic example of that is change blindness, where people don't notice the difference between two stimuli, that something has changed between one picture and another picture, even though they're looking for these changes. Change blindness doesn't occur all the time, but occurs often enough to suggest that the relationships between attention and consciousness are kind of loose. Just as a footnote, Dan Dennett, in his multiple drafts model of consciousness, predicts change blindness because, well, the one picture is one draft of these functional states, and the other picture is this other draft of these functional states. And it doesn't really matter what you see, which one you see. None of them have anything to do with how the system is actually operating. So there was that. And then there's this talk about zombies and this philosophical thought experiment about zombies that I think is quite interesting. And then Ravenswood goes on to talk about various ways in which we define consciousness, a discussion that's important because, as I pointed out in my lectures on mind and body, the neural correlate of consciousness that you identify is going to depend on how it is that you define consciousness. If you define consciousness as attention, you're going to get one neural correlate. If you define consciousness as qualia, you're going to get other kinds of neural correlates. Yeah? Yeah, I think that would be a good thing to do, to say, well, to kind of know how various investigators, not necessarily their names, but how various people have identified or defined consciousness in the past. And it kind of turns out to be important how these guys define consciousness. If you think, for example, about the Crick and Koch 40 hertz hypothesis, for example, in the first version of that hypothesis, they said 40 hertz synchronized firing at 40 hertz is critical for consciousness, right? That was their hypothesis. And then it turned out later on that, well, that's not quite right, that 40 hertz synchronized firing might be critical for binding two features of an object together, but it's not necessarily important for consciousness. So again, depending on how you define consciousness, you're going to either establish a neural correlate, like 40 hertz firing, or you're going to dismiss a neural correlate, like 40 hertz firing. Yeah? The second version basically says that 40 hertz synchronized firing is important for binding, but it's not necessarily important for consciousness, okay? You can think of it as kind of necessary but not sufficient. Whereas the first version thought it was sufficient. Anything else here? All right, then we talked about the various aspects of the mind-body problem. And again, picked up some themes from Revan Suo. This isn't a course in philosophy, but it's important for you to understand the basic terms of the mind-body debate as it occurs in philosophy. Again, because in cognitive science, if not in psychology, one of the jobs of the philosophers is to ask the questions, and another job of the philosophers is to check the answers, right? So it's important to kind of know that these questions that people try to address scientifically do have their origins in these old philosophical debates. So there's the dualism that Descartes gave us back in the 16th, 17th century, and various responses to Descartes, basically all trying to figure out how to get around what some of us have called Descartes' impasse, which is, okay, there's mind and there's body, and they're both there, and they're somehow different, but they're somehow related, and trying to figure out exactly how mind and body get related is this conundrum that is part of Descartes' legacy. And some people try to get around that by saying, well, you know, it's just all body. So if it's just all body, then we don't have to worry about the relationship between mind and body, because mind's gone from the discussion. And there are even some people who say, well, not so fast. Let's look at it the other way. There's just mind, right? And we don't have to talk about bodies either. And again, that's one way to solve the problem. But most people are still stuck somehow in Descartes' impasse, trying to figure out exactly how it is that mind and body are related. Again, if you're a behaviorist, you solve this problem really easily by just banning all mental discourse from your vocabulary, okay? Watson never talked about consciousness except to say, we can't talk about consciousness, right? Because we can't talk about something that's private and unobservable. And there's a similar trend in philosophy known as philosophical behaviorism. And then more recently, with the advent of neuroscience that really has a chance of getting at the neural bases of mind and behavior, you get people flirting with various kinds of reductionism, which in the hands of some people is just another way of thinking about the neural correlates of consciousness, but in the hands of some philosophers especially seems to be a way of, as with Watson, just getting consciousness and mental life out of the discussion.